This week on The Futurists, climate in crisis, the LA wildfires.
A random cinder might just blow down your canyon and ignite something, and then suddenly you're going to have a problem, and you never really know. And so it's that uncertainty and dread that hangs over everyone's head every night. That is actually the most telltale characteristic of living through these fires.
Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King, and, we've obviously been talking a lot about what's happening in LA with the wildfires, but we have at our disposal, of course, Los Angelino, I guess we call them, an inhabitant of Los Angeles who's been through the fires. I've got a lot of friends who lost places out on the PCR and in Malibu and in the Palisades. It's just the scale of this is crazy. But Rob,
Hi everybody.
You're sort of our reporter on the ground in LA.
But I'm living through this story as a resident, and I'm very happy to tell you a little bit about it. It's not a great story, but it's an interesting one because it has a lot to tell us about the future of big cities. So Brett, great to see you again. It's been some time. I'm very happy to connect with you all in the audience as well. So the last several weeks here have been, the last 2 weeks here have been quite intense in Los Angeles because of wildfires. Wildfires are nothing new. We get them every year. People on the East Coast have 4 seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter. Here we have spring and summer. It gets quite hot. And then we have a dry season, which turns into a fire season almost routinely around October or November. After the heat of the summer, the landscape is dried out. But that's usually followed by winter rains. Sometimes they start in December, sometimes they start in January. This year is different. So this year we have not had rain here for 300 days. So this place is very dry. We also had a very hot summer. And the previous 2 years, we had a lot of rain. So there's been a buildup of green things. The foliage in the hills has grown and grown. That's all fuel for fires. So everybody knew we were due for a big fire season, but I don't think anyone was prepared for exactly what this is. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But mainly you had all the ingredients you could possibly imagine to make for a bad fire season. A lot of greenery in the hills, a long period, almost a year of no rain, very hot summer to dry everything out. And then we got the winds. So normally our Santa Ana winds come from the desert in October. And that's one of the things that drives the fires. They come out of the desert to the east, and that means that they're quite dry. And they suck the moisture out of the air. They suck the moisture out of your skin. It's so dry here, Brett. I was typing a note to a friend. I could feel the skin on my knuckles when I was typing. I was like, gosh, that's an unusual sensation. Like everything's super dry. If I walk in my backyard, the leaves are crunchy. They're so dry, they turn to dust. Yeah. And then what happened last Tuesday is we had big winds, and of course a wildfire broke out. Now, you may have heard reports that the fire department wasn't prepared. That's not true. They do this all the time, so they're quite well prepared. We have a very good fire department here. But they had put their equipment where they expected the Santa Ana winds to come from, and this is what was different. This is what was unexpected. The winds came from a different direction, and the direction they came from, first of all, it wasn't where they had the equipment positioned, so they had to move everything quickly. But the second thing is that the winds came with such ferocity. Now, Brett, you can probably see from behind me that my house is situated on a bluff. I live on a ridge, a high ridge above a wooded canyon, like many people in Los Angeles. It's one of the attributes that makes the city such a beautiful city that you can live in the hills. And I'm right here in the Hollywood
from
Hills.
The Hollywood sign. Yeah,
that's exactly right. You can walk to the Hollywood sign from here. And this is an old neighborhood. It's been around for 100 years. For LA, that's quite old. So this place has survived, but there were fires here in the past. It's a very fire-prone area. We're in the fire zone, and many other people, thousands of people, have houses on the hills because it's so beautiful. But these hills have some attributes that are really dangerous in a fire. The first one, of course, is that the streets are quite narrow and twisty, so it makes it hard for people to drive up and down. They're also so narrow that you can't actually drive 2 cars at once. You have to be careful as you pass upcoming vehicles. So during a fire,
this is for dangerous. Fire engines.
Yeah, you can't bring the fire equipment in. So that's problem number one. And then the second problem is that because we're up high, there's a certain dynamic that the fire has. It comes roaring down the canyon, Canyons are like narrow, and they'll go for miles, right? So most of these canyons are 4 miles or 3 miles long.
Right, because it's a wind tunnel, right?
It builds into a wind tunnel, and the heat kind of creates its own weather system, which can intensify the winds. So the winds in the canyon can be up to 100 miles an hour, and that's what we had last Tuesday. So imagine winds that were blowing so hard, Brett, last week. I have a lot of trees in my yard. They were sideways. The wind was pushing mature trees sideways. I had 2 trees from my neighbor fall into my yard. They took out some of my trees as they fell. I had a tree in my yard that was blown so hard, it cut another tree in half. It decapitated another tree. And these are mature trees. So imagine this intense wind blowing. It's constant. It's constantly windy, but it comes in gusts. So it's like strong wind.
Warm, dry tinder.
And imagine pushing fire. Now, those palm trees that are so famous, the kind of iconic palm trees that we've got, well, when those start to burn at the top, they shoot sparks, and they shoot sparks really, really fast. They as they disintegrate, they turn into cinders. But with the wind like that, it turns a palm tree that's burning into a kind of machine gun that shoots out sparks. Hundreds of sparks per minute are getting shot at a velocity. It could be 100 miles an hour with the wind. Those burning cinders can go for hundreds. They can go for hundreds of feet. They can go for a mile sometimes. So you have a situation then where the wind is moving much faster than a motor vehicle. It's moving down these canyons that intensify it. And it's moving so fast that the fire department can't even reposition their equipment in time to get to the next fire. And so it's almost like a wall of flame that marches across the foothills in front of the mountains. Now, we do have these big, big mountains on the edge of town, like St. Gabriel's. Those are burning right now. And that's where one of the worst fires is. That rugged landscape is so steep, you can't climb it. So there's no way to fight the fire. They would typically let it just burn. But the foothills in front are some of the most valuable real estate in Los Angeles. Many, many people live there. Beautiful homes. They've been there for 100 years. These are really well-established neighborhoods, family neighborhoods. Those towns have burned to the ground.
Yeah.
There is nothing left of Altadena. There's nothing left of large parts of Palisades. Pacific Palisades was the nicest neighborhood in Los Angeles. The homes there were $5 to $7 million. A beautiful place where movie stars and directors like Steven Spielberg have their homes. That neighborhood is burned to the ground. It's unrecognizable. And when you see the footage, and I'm sure everyone listening to this has seen that on TV news, let me tell you, it's not exaggerated. This is the first time I've seen a news report that doesn't overhype or over-sensationalize. We're talking about areas that are 14 miles that have burned to the ground, where there's nothing left. No home is left, no school. The shopping malls, the grocery stores, the gas stations, every building has been burned to the ground. And think about it, Brett. How hot does it have to be to burn down a shopping mall, like to the ground, where there's just a couple of girders standing? It's so hot that they're finding now, as they go through the ruins, they're finding that the metal structures melted completely into a puddle. So that's how hot it is. We're talking like hundreds of degrees of heat. I'm bringing all that up because some of the impressions that you saw from people who don't live here is, gosh, the fire department wasn't prepared or they didn't respond. Well,
they didn't take water from the ocean because they were protecting the fish species.
The wind prevented them from flying, right? So the aircraft are really important, especially in the mountains. But the winds prevented them from flying because those aircraft fly just 100 or 200 feet above the ground. They can't fly in high wind. But in fact, the firefighters did a great job. There was no human agency on Earth that could stop a 100-mile-an-hour wind that's moving across the landscape, burning everything in its path. I mean, exactly what would you propose to do? And then some people say, well, they ran out of water. Yes, they did. They poured millions of gallons of water on this fire. You could not stop it, Brett. It's a 40-foot wall of flame.
Well, that's because of how big it is, right?
It's a huge area.
The huge fire front. So it of course, now it is the most costly economic loss for a natural disaster in the United States. Previously, Katrina was 200
insured losses, but that number keeps going up. So it's
AccuWeather has estimated total damage and economic loss, which is the measure we're looking at, not just insured losses, is going to be between $250 billion and $275 billion, right? So, so this is what the estimates are now. In terms of the costliest wildfire previously, it was also in California, and that was the 2018 Camp Fire. That was $12 billion worth of damage. So already we're well beyond that territory, and the overall economic and infrastructure damage, not just the insured losses, puts it closer to $300 billion, which is like...
That's astonishing.
But the point of this is that this is not, unfortunately, going to be an unusual thing
No,
happening.
that's right.
I can imagine this happening in Sydney in the next few years.
Well, they have that,
with
right?
in the
Americans forget, but in
yeah,
Sydney, just in 2019, 2020, there were those fires that went right down the east coast of Australia. And that fire lasted for
exactly.
weeks, actually months.
Exactly. So, you could imagine this affecting the northern suburbs of Sydney.
Mm.
So but the point of this is that the U.S. Department of Defense has projected that by 2035. The economic losses from extreme weather events and natural disasters is going to cost the U.S. annually more than the annual military budget.
Wow.
So
Which is about 900 billion. So,
right.
we're a third of the way there, according to
We're
your math.
not that far away. That's exactly the point. That's why I mentioned it. Right. It's only January.
If you think about last year, we had wildfires on the East Coast, which is really unusual. That's a wet environment, right? And you had the massive storms in Florida that went all the way up through North Carolina and Virginia. And those were record-breaking losses as well. So this is not a novelty. This is a pattern. It's extreme weather.
The North Carolina stuff, I had friends, my good friend Jay, in Asheville, their kids' school is obliterated by those floods, by the hurricane. And it's like, this is, just becoming more common, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And yes, we've always had extreme weather, but the economic numbers don't lie. You can't excuse it away for bad management or bad, or you can, to some extent, you mitigate it with infrastructure investment, but we're talking about a lot more infrastructure investment than what has been proposed. I mean, we're not even...
Well, and almost certainly what's going to happen is there'll be a lot of people who want to preserve what was there and rebuild it and go back to the status quo. And we know what's going to happen if they do that. We'll spend a great deal of money rebuilding, and 10 years from now, we'll have the same problem when everything grows back.
Unless we can... come up with some radical new standards, building codes that are,
they're going the other way. They're going the other way. So in order to make it easy to rebuild, they're talking about relaxing the building standards. And Brett, I got to tell you, this is a bad idea. It politically is going to be, very popular, of course, because homeowners are suffering. They don't want to spend money. But what that means is we're going to have vulnerability baked into the infrastructure.
So it's going to be baked into infrastructure, and you're not going to be able to be insured.
So we can talk a bit about insurance. And let me tell you also what it's like to live here. These are two good topics. Just on the insurance topic, we hear this all the time. Oh, insurance is going to be able to handle it. Let me say this about companies that think about the future. I would say the insurers are probably the best companies in the world at having a very calculated approach to the future. Insurers have been trying to pull out of California since the 1960s. Fire has always been the major reason, earthquake, of course. Now, earthquake insurance is not available from any private insurer. It's now something that the state provides. They run their own insurance company. As for fire, so many insurers have stopped underwriting homes here that the state insurance authorities had to do something different. So they created a plan called the FAIR Plan in the 1960s, and it was meant to be an insurer of last resort. So it's basically a state scheme that's backed up by private insurance. It only covers houses in the most extremely exposed areas, but it was never meant to be like a major insurer, but it's becoming the largest insurer because more and more areas of the state are uninsurable. And this is increasing. So I know people personally who just lost their home insurance as their home insurance company canceled their insurance policies, and they now were exposed to the fire. So they've lost everything and they have no insurance.
A year ago, of course, it's now wide knowledge, but State Farm cancelled a bunch of policies in this area because the fears that it was very dry. It was going to be a dry year, and they forecasted it. And they're like,
if they underwrite homes that they know are going to burn, they're going to go out of business. So the insurance companies have a tough job. They have to make sure that they stay in business and can pay out the policies. However, they're not going to underwrite a house that they know is in a dangerous place. So what we have then is perhaps the most rational economic message about what is insurable and what is not, which you can interpret as here's a message about which homes are most likely to burn. And in fact, that's where most of the FAIR Plan, this government scheme, That's where most of the homes are insured. And that's because it's the only kind of insurance they can get. So let's talk about FAIR for a minute. FAIR is run by the state of California, but it's backed up by private insurers. So basically the premise here is if a company wants to do business as a private insurance company in California, they have to contribute to the FAIR plan. They have to be the backup. So FAIR runs on a very low cost cash reserve basis. They have about $200 million of cash, and they can insure up to $2.5 billion of losses. But Brett, you already know the losses in this case are going to greatly exceed that. So now there's a big question of like, well, what happens when we go over $2.5 billion? We're certain to do that here in this case. The private insurance companies have to step in. Now, they changed the law last year. The insurers here, the insurance commissioner in California changed the law to make it more favorable to insurance companies. Very few people in California know this. It was just a deal that was done in order to keep a few private insurance companies in California. They said, well, if you want us to stay, you have to change it so that if we have to backstop the FAIR plan, we can pass that cost along to private homes who buy private insurance. In other words, they're going to redistribute the losses. When it goes over the $2.5 billion, which it's certain to do, what's going to happen is private homeowners like me who have private insurance are going to end up seeing their premiums go up. In other words, they're redistributing the risk back to California residents. Now, there's some speculation that the state of California is going to step in and maybe they'll bail out the FAIR plan. They probably will have to do that. California has $100 billion of debt already, $100 billion of bond debt. They might issue new bonds, and they have the ability to do that. And it's not a huge amount. It's the interest on the bonds is about 3% of the state budget, so they could do that. But if they do that, guess who's going to pay for those bonds? The rest of the state, the rest of the taxpayers in the state. So if you own a home in California, you're going to end up bailing out FAIR one way or the other. You're either going to do it through your home premiums on your home for your private insurance, or you're going to pay it in the form of bonds, bond service, which is paid through the taxes through the general fund. So in either case, what's going to happen here is the people who live in the riskiest environments, the people who the private insurers are telling us they know those houses are going to burn. They can't get insurance any other way. The cost of maintaining those private homes that are most exposed is going to be redistributed to the rest of the taxpayers in the state of California. That's almost a certainty, unless the federal government bails them out.
But I mean, it's still one of the higher taxed states. We hear about this all the time. It's a big talking point. And property taxes are insane in California already.
Well, no, they're pretty good here. They're bad on the East Coast. Here we have Proposition 1, I think, that prevents it from going up too much. But
that's if you sell, right? Because this is why I've got friends who are like, we can't afford to sell.
You can't afford to buy
because we can't afford to buy a new place and pay the property tax.
That's exactly right.
That's what I've heard. Yeah,
it's expensive, but also the cost of home ownership is going up. So, for instance, my home policy, my house insurance, has gone up threefold since 2020. And so this is, you see what's happening. The private insurers, to stay in business, they're cranking up the premiums, and they're going to do it again. It's a certainty after this that the premiums will go up one more time. So,
but not only that, it's also which I want to talk about after the break because we're coming up on the break. But what's going to happen to rent and livability in?
It's already happened. Oh no, I can tell you, it's already happened. So to rent a home here, of course, we already have a shortage of housing, and to rent a home for a family, the cost was about $10,000 a month. So first of all, let that sink in. $10,000 a month. Not a lot of people can afford a rent of $10,000 a month. That was 2 weeks ago. Now, after the fire, the home to rent a private home, similar private home, would cost $22,000 a month. They've doubled the rents in a week. I mean, that's certainly predatory. But on the other hand, there's the laws of supply and demand. There's tremendous demand. 10,000 families have been displaced that have lost everything. They need a place to live. And in addition, you've got more than 100,000 people who've been evacuated from their homes for their own safety. So there's a lot of people looking for a place to live in Southern California right now.
Yeah, it's crazy times. And I know also, I got a good friend who's just coming to Thailand. Actually, he's on the way here from LA. But he was he was evacuated and he had to find accommodation. And of course, all of the hotels put their rates up.
Yeah.
And he didn't get state provided accommodation. Like, this is the thing is, like, if you're in Europe, if you're in Germany and there was a wildfire and you got evacuated by the police, German government would provide you with accommodation, even if it was camping beds in a high school. They would, they would look after you, right? Because this is what it blows my mind, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And it
No,
blows my mind
there's
anyway.
this
But
Western ethos that we're meant to be like, independent and strong and private rights and all this. So, that mentality still persists to this day, where you can't look to the government to get a handout. But you're right, 100,000 people
anyway,
get kicked out of their homes. You're gonna have a problem putting those people up, and it is a real problem.
yeah.
I had people staying here at my house who were evacuated, and then a fire broke out just in the next canyon over. So just a short walk
Oh
from my
man.
house. You've been here.
Yeah.
Was the next fire, and actually it was pretty scary, Brett, because that was a big fire. And the people who evacuated, they said, "We're not going to stay." They packed up their stuff and they took off from
Oh
my house.
wow.
They're like, "We're afraid to stay in your house." I stayed, and it was fine, and
Oh
everything here is
wow.
okay. But
Wow.
my goodness, was that a funny moment?
Well, I mean, I have heard people, buying sprinkler systems and putting them on their roof, and it
Yeah,
saved
it's
their
very
house, and
controversial, right? Because they're
but
reducing the
yeah,
water pressure. That's one of the big
exactly.
issues. Up in the hills, the water pressure is not that strong to begin with. So if you're gonna like be the neighbor who takes all the water for your house,
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is true. This is true. All right. Well, let's take a quick break, and then after the break, let's talk about how this might reshape LA over the next few
yeah,
years, because
sure, great.
that's a pretty interesting conversation. Listening to the Futurists, we're talking about the Los Angeles wildfires, and we're going to be right back after this break. Welcome back to the Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King. We've been chatting to, of course, my co-host, Rob Tercek, about the LA wildfires from a perspective of a resident of Los Angeles, and what it was like. I don't know whether you guys saw the news around this, but when Mel Gibson was on Joe Rogan, he was talking about all crazy stuff. And then later that night, he was in Mar-a-Lago with Trump, apparently sitting next to Russell Brand. And there's this clip
Oh,
of Mel Gibson talking to Russell Brand on microphone going, "My effing house is burning down right now," and it's, and like, there was others that expressed this sort of thing. I've got friends who have lost their homes. John Robert Sutton, who as example, was away overseas when he
mhm.
found out the news. And what's it like psychologically to be in this place where there's been so much of this infrastructure loss, Rob?
So let's think about it. There's four different people to think through as you talk about that. So there's the people who lost their homes. There are the firefighters who put their lives on the line. There are people like me who live in the hills in vulnerable areas, and then there are people in the flat areas because LA is a basin, so most of it is
Mm.
flat. We're talking about like 60 miles of flat, and those people are largely unaffected. So first, for the people who lost everything, here was the situation. The fires, as I said earlier, they came to areas that typically didn't get wildfires. It's very rare that houses burn. Usually it's up in the mountains in the hills where there's wildlife. Um, this time it was right in the middle of residential neighborhoods. In many cases, people had 15 or 30 minutes to leave. So you would get an evacuation notice, or you'd see fire engines coming, and then they'd knock on your door and they'd be told to leave right now. Like, don't wait, don't stop, don't pack, grab whatever you can, get in your car and get out of here.
Mm.
And the two places that got hit the worst didn't have great evacuation plans. We're talking about long, narrow canyons, sometimes miles long. So if one person stops to like deal with their dog, or they have trouble, or they get, their big car can't fit down the narrow street so easily, all the other cars behind them get stuck. And so at one point in the Palisades, in one of those canyons, people were told to get out on foot, leave their car on the side of the road, and run. And they had to run from the oncoming flames. So it'll give you a sense of like the sheer terror. And I know I
Mm.
live in Los Angeles and we love drama in this town, and it sounds like maybe I'm being dramatic. I'm actually understating how terrifying that incident was. So people left with just the shirt on their back and the shoes on their feet. Now I have a friend in Altadena who had that experience. He was texting me on Wednesday morning and he said, "Oh my gosh, got to go. Cinders just landed in my neighbor's yard. I got to go put them out." But you can step on one or two cinders. You can't step on 300. So
Yeah.
2 hours later, he sent me a text and showed me how his house and the entire neighborhood had burned to the ground. And he sent me an almost surrealistic video of driving shortly after the fire, while it was still burning, but it had passed through and down to the next neighborhood. And it's astounding. He drove back with a neighbor to see if they could save their homes. And they passed one house after another, gone, scratched, burned to the ground, like
Yeah.
nothing left but a chimney and a smoldering crater where a house
Yeah.
used to be. So that's the people who lived here. They had that shocking experience of total loss
I've
in the
seen
morning,
videos of people coming up in cars with their friends, or with
weeping,
their
because like literally,
family, like, let's see if our house survived. Oh
yeah,
no,
you
like,
turn the corner and you just see
and
smoke and
one
ash.
guy, very typical California, is like, "Oh, dude, that's totally gnarly, dude."
Mm.
That's like, what a California reaction to
Yeah,
such an
tell me.
incredibly painful event,
These people are tough and creative, though, and so they're going to rebuild. Like everyone I've talked to who's lost their home, I know many people who have. They're determined to stay, and they're going to rebuild. So that's that attribute. Now you have the firefighters. Let's talk about these guys for a second because they are genuine heroes. I know we live in a time where it's fashionable to bash government, but we have to think about government servants are civil servants. And no one exemplifies that better than a firefighter. These are people who, when all the families are coming down away from the fire, they're going the opposite direction. They're marching into the fire.
Yeah.
These people, the firemen and firewomen, they're very rugged. They will carry 60 pounds of equipment. They climb up the hills without trails
Yeah,
in
they
the
carry
darkness.
chainsaws
They
and
carry
stuff, and
chainsaws filled with gasoline
yeah,
toward the
yeah.
fire, which is insane. They can't use oxygen because oxygen can explode. So that's dangerous. So they're breathing ash and smoke in
Oh
the dark.
man.
Now, Brett, you and I have hiked in these hills, and it's quite a strenuous hike to go up the hill.
Yeah,
Imagine doing
yeah.
that in the
They're doing
dark
that with
with a
yeah.
fire going on. So these are genuine heroes. They do an amazing job. We are deeply grateful to them, but they are people with grim determination. They understand their job. They're very serious people. When you talk to firemen, it's not a joke. They don't laugh about it like they talk about how it's extraordinarily dangerous. And of course, every year they lose some of their colleagues. Then there are people like me. I live in the hills. I live in a canyon. As I said, my house is quite vulnerable. So if we have a fire here, I'm going to have a real dangerous time. Um, People like me live under a constant threat right now. So the conditions haven't changed. We still have wind. We still have dryness. There's no rain
It's
in
still
sight.
dry, hasn't rained. Yep.
And so every night you got to double check and make sure you've got your car keys, your house keys, your shoes, your go bag right by the door in case you have to run out of here. I have two plans. One plan is my car, which is packed and ready to go. The other plan is if the road's blocked or busy, I can get out on foot. My house happens to be where I can go down the hill by foot if I have to, and I could be down in the level ground about 15 minutes if I move fast. But that's the way you have to think every night.
Mm.
It's almost like a war zone in a sense. I know I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but the mentality is somewhat stressful and suspenseful in the
Well,
sense
no,
that
but I mean,
you never know.
these natural disasters. I mean, we're talking about the most expensive natural disaster in
Yeah,
U.S. history. This is PTSD. This is
that's exactly right.
trauma. It's
Well, and it really is a thing. It's not hypothetical. Just over the
yeah.
hill that way from my house, there is a wildfire that's covering about 14 miles of space, and it is not fully contained, and it's still burning, and the wind is still blowing. It could go in any
Could
direction.
flare up again. Yeah.
The Palisades fire is also still burning out of control. They just managed to stop it before it got to Brentwood. An amazing story. The fire department stopped it at a ridge above Mandeville Canyon. It's a
Mm.
beautiful street, about a 4 mile canyon, and they stopped it at the ridge. But they had to remove all the vegetation on that hillside in the dark. It's an amazing story. Yeah, so for everybody who lives in a vulnerable place, lives with kind of a sword dangling over their head because you never know. And I'll tell you how it
Mm.
is. If I have to go to the grocery store, I really think long and hard about when should I go down the hill to the grocery store
Mm.
because I might not be able to get back if there's a fire. So what do I take? Do I take all my stuff with me? Do I have to
Oh
live like
wow.
that? And so you're
Yeah.
constantly plotting out your plan, which means in your mind, you're constantly imagining the worst case scenario every time you leave your house, every
Yeah.
time you
Well,
go to
because
bed.
you have to be defensive. Have a
Yeah.
strategy for this stuff. Yeah.
I have a crew that removed all the vegetation downslope from my house. They're coming back next week and they're going to start to remove all the wooden decks because it turns out decks, everybody in the hills loves to have a nice big deck, but those decks are a fire trap because the flames come from below, they heat it up, and then it burns, and now it's like a bonfire. So I'm having all that replaced with concrete starting next week. So you have to take proactive measures. One thing I will say, it's pretty cool, even though people here are big on private property and private ownership, all of my neighbors do participate in mandatory hillside clearance every year, and everyone is very good about doing this. This is a requirement by law. If you live in the fire zone, you have to clear all the ground vegetation. You have to trim your trees back 30 feet away from your house and so on. Now, we've
Well,
seen
it's good that everybody carries their weight with that. Yeah.
they do that, yeah. But on the other hand, you've also seen in a wildfire where the wind's 100 miles an hour, that's like holding a piece of newspaper in front of a machine gun. It's not going to really
Yeah.
stop the fire, unfortunately.
Yeah. True.
Then the last part of it is that there are people in the flats. And for these people, life goes on as normal. And they see smoke from the hills in the distance. They can see the flames at night.
Yeah.
But for them, life hasn't changed much. The cafes are still open, the grocery stores are open, kids are going to school, parents are going to work, and for them, life goes on as normal. So this is the strange time that we're in. On the one hand, there's 10,000 families that lost everything, 100,000 families evacuated, then many more thousands who live in a vulnerable zone. And the people who are dealing with the fire, the first responders, these people are in a state of high stress and turmoil. But then you have millions of people who live not far from here. And those people are going on, life is normal. It's almost like two different worlds. What makes a fire different from things like, say, the big hurricanes they get on the East Coast? With the hurricanes, you know it's coming. They can plot it. You have 3 days notice minimum, usually longer. If you're in the path of the hurricane, there's an evacuation route that's been set forth. And though they have huge traffic jams, that gets gnarled up. It's not always a beautiful process. If you want to get out, you can. If you plan ahead, you can get out and you can survive. Here, it's quite different. This is more like going to Las Vegas. A random cinder might just blow down your canyon and ignite something, and then suddenly you're going to have a problem, and you never really know. And so it's that uncertainty and dread that hangs over everyone's head every night. That is actually the most telltale characteristic of living through these fires.
Yeah, tough. Well, I mean, we can talk about the short-term responses, federal funding to support rebuilding these communities and so forth. But
what do you think they should do? This is a town where 20 million people live in Southern California, right? That's like the population of some countries. This state is the economic engine of the country.
It's the fifth or sixth largest GDP economically in the world, and in terms of per capita GDP, California produces more per capita GDP than any other state.
By the way, that's an argument for the federal government to step in with massive relief funds, which they did do after the Northridge earthquake, and it stimulated the California economy. It's almost like a bailout, but California pulls the rest of the state. Remember, when we pay taxes to the federal government here, we only get 80% back in federal services. So we're funding other states that don't manage to top up.
No, but I mean, what's happening in LA and the adaptability of the infrastructure, how do you make cities that can survive this with, you can just turn everything into concrete, but that actually is not going to fix it either.
People are saying they should do that, right?
Well,
that's what they did in the past with the LA River. People don't realize there's a river here, but there was a big river in the middle of the city. And in the 1930s, they paved it completely with concrete to control it because it would jump out of its riverbed frequently when the storms came. That's an environmental disaster. Now they're trying to undo that work.
Yes. And so, the concrete will create this massive heat sink, which creates, accentuates the problem. So there has to be a broad program of adaptability of infrastructure in Los Angeles. But this is going to have to happen globally. This is the mind-blowing thing is if you want to make LA fireproof in the future, you have to have a decade-long program of infrastructure upgrades, right? In the Middle East, if you want to make it livable when the temperatures are hitting 56 and 57 degrees Celsius, later next decade, you are going to have to engineer the environment for survivability. Air quality is going to be a major issue. So, here we've had bad air quality in Bangkok the last couple of weeks because the farmers up in the north are burning their crops because it's their traditional method of preparing the fields for the next harvest, right? And for the next plant. This creates all this. So, but we can fix this it's just takes money and a whole lot of effort.
Well, and willpower, right? So it's not just money, because money's available, and if you create the right economic incentives, private industry will take over, right? And that's the story of Los Angeles. This is a completely invented, engineered landscape from day one. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was a booming town promoted by railroad companies. They were trying to get people to move from the crowded East Coast cities out to the West. They promoted this idea of California as paradise. It's not inaccurate. It is a very nice place. But they developed in an unplanned way. Now, I was just reading a terrific book by Mike Davis, Ecology of Fear. If you're interested in Los Angeles, this is the book, Mike Davis's Ecology of Fear. And it's just by coincidence I happened to be reading it right before these fires came. He talks about the wildfire fear and the dangerous environment that we live in. This is a very unstable environment because of earthquakes. We also have floods. We also get mudslides and hillsides and so forth. It's a constantly evolving landscape. And the story of Los Angeles from the 1900s on is a story of massive engineering efforts to try to control or tame or contain the environmental forces. Now, Brett, you and I know that's an impossible task. So it always goes wrong in unusual ways. And we've messed up our water supply. We've messed up our rivers. The water for Los Angeles actually comes from 500 miles north, the Owens Valley.
Yeah.
Up part in
Well,
Eastern
the Colorado
California.
River and everything, yeah.
We steal the water from other places because there's not enough water here. So essentially, it's overdeveloped for what it is. And I don't know how long the taxpayers in the state and the other parts of the state are going to continue to tolerate subsidizing the people that live in the most dangerous places. So you're going to have a very contentious debate here about whether or not those homes should be condemned and whether that land at the urban wildlife interface, if that land.
But we're going to have the same. I mean, think of the scale of this problem. Let's say we decide that 3 or 4 million people out of Los Angeles have to be relocated, or 5 million, right? And let's say we say the same of Miami-Dade County. In fact, we're probably going to have to relocate at least half of that population at some point in the next 20 years, right? Or 30 years.
Because it's going to be underwater.
Yeah. So you think about the scale of, you think about the air quality issues now in Los Angeles and the medical costs that's going to increase. We are we're putting off spending this money on mitigating these problems because the political cost of that is so great.
Yeah.
But the cost to the environment and the cost to our future economic stability that's getting greater and greater all the time.
The
right?
bill keeps going up,
we
and
wait,
we keep ordering the same menu, right? It's true. So look, you look around the landscape. You know the United States. Do you see any political leader from any party who's got the charisma and vision to say to people, "We're going to have to revise completely"?
No, it's not even close.
No, it's even
not
worse,
even
Brett.
close to that point.
Brett, let me get on my soapbox
you
for
see,
a second.
You're right. No, I've seen it, dude. I've seen Elon and the MAGAs blaming Newsom and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah,
and I'm
that's
like,
exactly right. No, they're politicizing it. They're gonna do. We've talked about
a solution. It's
stupid.
It's not a solution.
It's terrible. It's
just avoiding it
for no purpose. They're going to gain nothing. So
because the cost of doing something is politically untenable. That's why they have to deny that it's a thing, right?
So you may recall this from our friend Jay and the story of Florida and in North Carolina. These are states that are very supportive of Trump. They're very red. And just last year when they had their natural disasters, there was a wild accusation that the Biden government, the Democratic government, was withholding federal funds to penalize those places. It wasn't true. It was completely made up. In fact, the people like Jay who are there, they're very happy with the support that they got. They were like, we love FEMA. We're getting all kinds of support for them. But there was this wild story that was being spread around in right-wing media that the federal government was withholding it for political reasons. Okay, here we are a year later, and now we have California, which is a very liberal state, famously anti-Trump state. And right now, the leadership in Washington, this is not me making it up, the leadership in Washington is already talking about withholding federal bailout money for the state, relief funds for the state that have already been committed by President Biden. They're talking about withholding that money in order to extract votes from Democrats to support some other bills. In other words, they're doing the exact same thing that they accused Democrats falsely of doing it last year. That's now policy. This is not the first time it's happened. And people have very little memory here, but we had Northridge earthquakes here in 1994. Those are massive earthquakes that knocked down freeways, knocked down whole buildings. They were devastating. At that time, Bill Clinton decided to provide a lot of bailout money. It was actually a brilliant move. It was basically an investment. He understood that California is an economic engine, and if it went into recession because of the natural disaster, it would hurt the whole country. So he went the other way. He provided a stimulus. It took about a year. After that, California's economy recovered, and it pulled the rest of the national economy out of recession. That's a smart move. But at that time, the Republicans, under Newt Gingrich, they did the exact same thing. On the last round of funding that was supposed to go out, they put all these conditions on it in order to extract some political power from it. So this is a politicization of funding. It should not happen, and they're doing it for the wrong reasons. But they're also doing it. It's going to be like your own goal. They're going to be self-defeating. If California goes into
I
recession
don't
because of this,
know
it
how.
hurts the
I
whole
mean,
country.
there's no simpler way to say that the cost of us not doing anything is so financially damaging to Americans and the nation as a
To the
whole.
whole country.
It's going to add so much to the deficit. Think about the entire military budget going on the deficit every year. That's what extreme weather events is going to cost us, unless we have to do, unless we do something ahead of it. But ultimately, what we come back to is the cost of like, so let's take Superstorm Sandy in New York. The cost of reinforcing Manhattan is estimated to be somewhere between 30 and 50 billion. And so that sounds like a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money when you think that Superstorm Sandy cost 90 billion in economic loss, right?
Also,
So
the
it's a
cost of not having
no-brainer.
New York as an economic engine would be a massive loss, right?
Right. So a 50 billion investment in that alone is a no-brainer, but they can't get it done. Right. And so LA, you've got the politicization of the Dems versus Republicans. And then Miami, it's like, well, politically, again, it's untenable. The current Republican leadership in the state could not credibly go to their followers and stay in power if they said, listen, guys, this climate change thing is real and we got to save Miami. Right. Like that would be the end of the Florida Republican Party.
How real does it have to get before people start
This is the question. This is the question. What does LA look like in 20 years' time if we don't do this now?
This is it. I've been talking to my brother about this. I have a brother in Florida, by the way, and he and I were talking about natural disaster. He said, look, it's pretty clear that the problem you have in California is going to keep coming back every year until people get the message. And I said, well, if that's true, my house and all these houses around me in this canyon are going to be gone. And you know what? It's a matter of time, Brett. That is what I just said is likely to be the case. All the canyons are going to burn at some point. This whole state is going to be exposed to extreme weather. But it's true for every coastal community. It's also true for any state that has the Mississippi or Missouri River running through it. We're all going to face extreme weather. So we have to really think carefully about it. The funny part about this is a self-invented problem that came in after the Europeans arrived. The people who lived here before, the native people, the indigenous people, they understood wildfire. They understood they have to have small controlled fires every year. They understood how to manage the watershed. They understood how to manage everything in the environment so that they were self-sustaining.
Yep.
We have lost touch with that. Unfortunately, we're deeply.
This is where we have to, we had Chief Tashka on a couple of months ago talking about the Amazon. And, he was saying, we've never seen, in the history of my people, we've never seen the Amazon reacting like this. We've never seen. And it's like we don't listen to those First Nation people enough to understand that this is a seismic change, that humans are reshaping the planet in this way. But it doesn't matter. Ultimately, whether you believe in that climate change is man-made or not, it doesn't matter. The numbers don't lie. The economic impact of this is going to require us to deal with this at some point,
Yeah, you're right. Nature has a habit of asking the same question again and again and again until it gets a satisfactory answer. We haven't come up with an answer yet.
No, capitalism in its current form is not the answer, unfortunately.
It's all rooted in this Victorian idea that you can conquer the world and control it with science, right? We have this conviction. Everybody on some level believes that, right? It's
maybe eventually we can, Kardashev level 1 society and all of those sort of things. But we're not. But not in the economic system we have.
Civilization is this thin veneer on top of this phenomenally forceful power of nature. Like, we can manage it for a little while. No, I know,
but
we can't control it.
If you look at many of these problems are not actually technological problems, right? For example, we could build buildings if we put ourselves the highest building code standards we could think of. We could build fire-resistant and flood-resistant dwellings. We wouldn't put them where we put them now. We'd relocate people. We'd put them in areas that are optimal for living. We'd geoengineer those spaces to
in fact, that's what they did in Australia, right? They made the bushfire-resistant houses. Like, if you want to build in that zone, they're like, you can build in that zone, but it has to meet these stringent requirements.
Yeah, this is it. You've got to have metal roofs, et cetera.
Americans we're able to learn from other countries. We could pay attention to Australia and learn
But this is, I think, we just are on this path of adaptability now, and the economies that adapt, the economies that spend the money, the economies that invest in this early are going to have big payoffs in the future because they're going to be seen as so much more weather stable and climate stable in the future. So, I mean, this is, we had Parag Khanna on a few months ago. We should get him back on, actually. But this is Parag's entire business with Alpha Geo,
investing in real estate that's future proof or weatherproof.
Yeah. So
smart.
Anyway, listen, we got to wrap.
Okay.
We got to wrap.
Great
brother.
to see you again. Anyway,
good to see you.
Fine.
And
we're
listen,
recovering.
we send all our love from the show and the listeners and to you guys as a group and to you personally, bro. So take care of yourselves and keep giving us updates on this as you can. But thank you for the story and the heartfelt comments.
Thank you very much.
All right, guys, that's the Futurist for this week. You know what we do. You know how to make it better. So get out there and tweet us out or whatever you like to do to help us spread the word. And we thank the team for helping us put the show together this week. I'm tired. It's late on a Friday night. It's a pretty interesting conversation, but I get pretty emotional about it. But I'm glad you could be here with us. And
thank you. Thanks for doing that on a Friday night, Brett. Great to see you.
We'll see you guys in the future.